to the Gauntlet podcast. My name is Lowell. I'm joined by my co-host Sherry.
Hello.
And today we have as our guest Austin Ramsey, who is the author of Saber, Alone in the House, Tomb of the Gods, and The Air Tonight. These are all games that are available on itch, and Austin's going to talk about the big one.
Yes, in many ways it is the big one of those 4 games.
Yeah, I was looking through it earlier today, and I had looked at it before, but we'll get to that because it is really cool. But listeners, we have a couple of segments that we do, and our first segment is one in which we look at a game that we played on the Gauntlet Hangouts in the previous period, which in this case is December, January, and pick one and talk about it a little bit in depth, and then the other 2 people involved will ask questions or put in comments as well. So Sherry, tell us about your December, January.
Okay, for me, I played Trail of Cthulhu, Scum and Villainy, our homebrew game Action Cards, which is fate-based, and a campaign that we call Ocean City Interface. Played Monster of the Week, played 13th Age, and played Legacy. On Gauntlet, I played Masks, Take My Revolution, and Have a Familiar Ring. Those last 2 games were written by Jamila Najati. They're available on itch.io. And the one that I want to talk about today is Have a Familiar Ring. Again, this is a Sword Queen game by Jamila Najati. It's a story game that was written for the Your Move Jam that was on itch.io. So this means that the entire game revolves around a single PBTA-style move. In it, the players create a story about a magic user and the familiars of that magic user. They collaborate on the tone of the story. One player creates a mage, and the others create familiars who accompany that mage. The game text is about the play of the game being treated as a ritual. So there's lots of attention paid to atmosphere creation and moving through the story setup. It's a very free-form game once the players launch into the narrative and the role play. So the ritual's there to provide some structure to fall back on. Each step of the story creation process has 3 steps, and then there are 3 types of creation. So that's the basics. And like all of the Sword Queen games, you can find those on itch.io. And if you haven't looked at those, I suggest you go because Jamila has a lot of gems out there. So for this particular play and this game, what I really liked about it was the 3-step world and character creation was very satisfying. There was an abundance, but not too many suggestions out there that modeled how to describe the characters. I'm not sure if it's because Jamila's designs as they lay out the game, that they're putting it together as a document and designing in that same space, but they end up creating a very satisfying array of options without making the process seem overwhelming at all. And also, it's very striking when you read the document about how keenly chosen each word was. There's no dross in there, and there's nothing so-so or mundane. Everything has a spark to it. So it's a real pleasure to read as a game text. The single move that you're working around is called When Magic Demands a Price, and it's a generous PBTA move, and it prompts the players to add more story to the outcome. It creates a higher chance of success for cozy stories. If the magic user and the familiars are in sync with each other, there's a higher chance of success. And the more that they're working against each other, the chances of failure or success with cost goes up. And when the characters are more odds, they're definitely going to have a little bit more trouble using that magic, especially if they're using it casually. So it's a very clever move because it kind of adjusts the level of success based on the kind of story you and the other players have chosen to tell. The more at odds you are, the more that magic will be complicated. What I really dug was that the story explicitly calls out an epilogue also for each character. So that means that everyone gets that last word on what has gone on for their character. And that's such a simple and meaningful way to provide each character with a chance to express their headcanon. So those are the sort of things that really struck me as awesome about this game. Now, when I was playing it, though, I had some things I was a little less sure about. I had a great time with the game and the players. Sabine and Scott Puckett were all delightful every step of the way. They had great, sharp characters. But I kept thinking about how I could have made decisions at the very beginning that would have given us more flavoursome material to work with, I happened to choose an abstract magic type, pacts and promises, and then an impersonal foe, which was, corporation. And so it just made everything a little bit more difficult for the first play. It was kind of a dumb choice on my part, but it was something that I hadn't had any experience with, and just as it rolled out, that was sort of what had popped into my head about some of the other things. So I made some choices that made the storytelling more difficult. And then the other thing is of course, for me, online play and my social hang-ups about wanting to see reactions really magnified my hesitancy in being a storyteller. I didn't know when it was the best time to step in or when to react and when to go. So it was like sort of a thing that always exacerbates my feeling that I should say a thing, if that makes any sense.
And I have to interrupt here and say, this is a game that I made a huge mistake with and that I have to own up to. This is a GM-less game, but when I put on online games, and I said this the last episode that we recorded, when there's a GM-less game, my instinct is to be a facilitator and have the players play, and I kind of stand outside. I did that with this game, and because of the structure of the game, when scenes popped up, the players were looking to me like I was a GM because of the way the game is structured, and I ended up causing much more problems and difficulties for the players than I was helping them.
Yes.
It was so dumb. It was like a truly stupid move.
No, it was completely true that the abstract choices that I had made, plus you being there, we would look to you to provide a face of the problem and conflict, or to kind of start to give us more of an obstacle. So instead of depending on each other, we had a sort of distraction that we are used to getting solutions from. So it was just one of those things like having your parent hang around at the slumber party. Maybe not so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Austin, do you have questions, or what's your experience with GM-less games or these kinds? Because you've written some nice, tight story games, the ones I mentioned earlier.
I was actually wondering, you mentioned, Sherry, that part of the thing that determines how well the ritual goes is how in sync the familiars are with each other and the spellcaster. What reasons would they have to have opposing goals in this game?
Well, I think that's the thing, is that the only reason and the sole reason is that the kind of story you want to tell. The whole thing is about coming to an agreement of what kind of story the group of you is going to play, or going to not play, but to tell. And it is a storytelling game first and foremost. So it was, we had come down of, we wanted an optimistic story, and it ended up being optimistic to the point of being a cozy story.
Okay. Yeah, no, I get what you mean.
Yeah. So it was just more of a set of agreements, and just a little bit of, we had a few tangles that made it a little bit harder because we were online. I do think that it is one of those things where having people right there, and you can judge their reactions better and get a gauge of when you can add something without stepping on them is really critical. So, at least for me.
Now, obviously this wasn't the goal with the group. As you said, your goal from the start was to have a very cozy game. But I was wondering, like, if the group decided that they did want to have some internal conflict, would, like, the character creation process assist in how, where those conflicts might arise, such as what your adversary is or your form of magic?
Most of the character creation is about yourself, and then the world creation is where you're going to choose your adversary and your problems. But there were plenty of options to have things darker and more adversarial, even between the mage and the familiars. So because the process of becoming a familiar doesn't have to be a sweet and loving one. It can be, a contract or something coercive, or, actually downright awful. But we started out kind, we went a little abstract, and we made it harder for ourselves to tell a satisfying story, I think. So it was just interesting. I learned that you want to put a little pepper in it when you do it now, for sure. But it was just, the thing is that those were all choices that we made. And it's a thing that makes me want to play it again. Because now that I've done it, I go back and I go, oh, well, when I make these choices, that will give us a clear path to the kind of story that we can tell and to have some things to hold on to. And that is what my takeaway was, is this is a game I want to practice. And it's kind of like a ritual. I do think that I could see a group of folks getting better at playing it as they play it over a couple of times. And because it calls first for a sense of story and then secondarily for role playing. So it's not as instinctive for me, storytelling, building the story or the elements of the story. And so a little practice would definitely help. Some experimentation with both the elements of the story and other players, getting a sense of how they work and what their jam is and where they want to be going with things. The other thing is that I did like, the game is a storytelling game, so it has that single point of adjudication. So the only time that you go for dice and you get a random thing that you have to react to is when you choose to do magic. If you aren't doing a lot of magic, if your story isn't about spell after spell after spell, then you're having to make situations that create difficulties and obstacles. That was cool, but it was harder because of the way that we set it up to begin with. The structure that Jamila had added around the game makes it special, and their talent in identifying the just so points for steering the collaboration and the decision making in the world and the character is great. I wish that I had a better instinct myself, and I do want to go back and practice that.
Awesome. Anything else you want to say about that?
Like I said, I want to play it face-to-face, so...
Okay. It's interesting because the game that I played today, I don't think I'd want to play it face-to-face.
Really?
But playing it online actually was a super service. I'll talk about that in the December, January. Off Gauntlet, Trail of Cthulhu, Scum and Villainy, the Action Cards, Monster of the Week, 13th Age, all the same things as Sherry has mentioned. On Gauntlet had a great set of things. Got to play Passiones, got to play Root, got to play Pipe Dream, got to play Parts of Wulin, got to play Legacy, Take My Revolution, badly sat in on Have a Familiar Ring, Veiled Fantasy, which is what I talked about last time, and then I ran Worldwide Wrestling, a session of that. But the game that I played just an hour or two before we're recording this is a game called Purplest Prose by Pamu. And it is described as a trashy game about trashy writers writing trashy romance novels. And I wasn't sure what it was going to be like. I had some expectations, this would be kind of fun story game. I had a great time. The structure is very simple. It's that you're all writers and you've been called in, and this is sort of your last chance, and you have to collaboratively put together this romance novel. You randomly generate one character and then a second character. So we have our two lovers and then a situation. And you come up with a pen name for yourself and a kind of persona. And then there's a list of 13 chapters. Like chapter 1 is introduction of the first character. Chapter 2 is introduction of the second character. These are rounds. So in a round, one of the 4 players, because we had 4 players, one of them takes the role of the editor-in-chief and says, okay, now we need to establish our first character. And in the case of us, we had an artist and a crime lord / assassin. Mm-hmm. And then it was old lovers meet again was the sort of setup for this. Because I started out, I said, who's our character? And then everybody the book says 2 minutes, we did 4 minutes, chance to write up a little bit, just a little excerpt, like some lines from that chapter that set that up. And people did that on kind of a scrap thing on TextPad or WordPad or whatever. And then we anonymously cut and pasted that into a shared document. The editor-in-chief then reads all 3 of these aloud and then picks the one that they think is the best one. And so it's like apples to apples, those kinds of games. And we put it in the document. And it's a great framework. This is what I love about it. It's a great framework. It works. The chapters are really well chosen. It's great collaborative play because everybody's building in different ways off of the previous entry or the previous ideas. And that felt really good, where you could see the threads move along as the story developed. Because we have stuff established, we have fiction built up, and later people are pulling in tweaks, and we get it's the main character's sister threatened, and one of them's a sculptor, and so there's references to their sculpting and things like that. And there's sex scenes, sexy time scenes, so we have to figure out how to write around those. There is so much room to be both absolutely trashy and over the top and overly flourished And then at the same time, so much room to just be sincere, because when you read them out, it doesn't have to be over the top. The moments that kind of grab people are when they actually get like real human emotion mixed in with this kind of wild text. It's great. It's a super fun story game structure. It's so open for development. Like, we just did one pairing and one little story type, and Pamu's got a big chart for this. There's 36 options for each. And when we would come around on somebody's round, the editor-in-chief, you would assume an editor-in-chief character, and you'd be gruff, or you're talking about what you want for this chapter, and you only have 4 minutes to write this. And the picking of people was a pretty even split on things. Nice cliffhangers. We had a great resolution. So it is a collaborative story game in the most story gamey way. There's no mechanics of resolution. It's just story writing and putting it together, and it was good and it was fun. There are only 2 little bits that I have any kind of concern about, maybe 3. One is, it is super easy to do it online because you can type into a scratch pad and make edits and then cut and paste that. Face-to-face, you'd be writing things on index cards like you would do in Microscope or things like that. But you'd have to write a lot. Like, you want to do a full paragraph, and I think that would be harder to do, a little more taxing to do face-to-face. Online, I think it's really much easier to do because you have access to better editing, easier to work with. 2, I don't think 2 minutes is long enough. We did 4 minutes, and we were still, felt pressure, but we surprisingly, in 4 minutes, we got good, solid, multi-sentence paragraphs that had interesting stuff to them. And then finally, the other thing I'm uncertain about is there is this token system where if your passage is chosen, then you get a token, and at the end we see who has the most tokens. You don't even need that. You don't even need that. I mean, it tells you who got the most, but that kind of doesn't matter because the journey is so much fun. I come from a trad background. It took me a while to get into PBTA and Trindle and Tridindi and all of that, but this was great. This is a great story game. It's simple, and I think I just super enjoyed it. So, questions? Comments?
So, how many of your selections got chosen?
I had, of the 13 chapters, I had 3 of my selections chosen.
Not bad.
And I will say this. There were multiple times when we had to sit there and go, oh my gosh, because all 3 of the entries would be really good. And they'd be very different directions. And they were hard choices. Just really good hard choices.
So did you have a time limit on the deciding?
No, we didn't put a time limit on the deciding. I would just be there going, oh my God, how do I pick this? It was great. Austin, any questions, comments?
Yeah, I was wondering, obviously you'd have to change the writing prompts for the chapters in the initial setup, but how well do you think this might work for like a version that takes it out of the, romance genre and puts it into magical realism or fantasy or etc.?
Oh, I was going to say that I think you'd need like an over-amplified genre like pulp or something like that, but you said magical realism, and yeah, I think that would be really interesting to set it up, what the limits are, and start pulling together the motifs and the story elements and the symbology through it. That's a really good idea. This would definitely be a game that would be fun, trying it in different genres with different sets of people.
So long as you're not trying to write something that requires subtle wordplay.
Yes, yes. You really do have to be a little obvious. And so my trick is always to put at the end of my paragraph, and then they pull a gun, that kind of thing, so that I have the built-in cliffhanger there. But yeah, I think this could easily be modified. I think all it would take is doing a whole set of different prompts. I would love it if Pamu were to take this and redo it with a whole bunch of genres and a whole bunch of lists. I think that would be dynamite. It'd be fun. I would play this again in a heartbeat.
What obviously this would change the dynamic of the game a lot, but how do you think I was just thinking of NaNoWriMo, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how might the game change if the time limit were extended to like a half hour, an hour, a day, and you played over the course of a month?
That's a really interesting. There's something beautiful that comes from the time constraint.
Absolutely.
You're really under the gun. I think it would work, but I don't think you would get the same kind of energy. It'd be a different kind of energy that you would get from that game.
Yeah, I guess it might come out as more play by post sort of feel.
Yeah, in some ways, this is like a big micro compressed play by post game. That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it that way at all. But yeah, you're right.
That would actually be an entirely different framework that would be interesting to play with. Would be the genre is a play by post RP. So you're RPing an RP.
I like it with a kind of a choose your own adventure. Everybody's sharing the characters and they have to make the choice. And I like that rotating GM.
Yeah.
That's great. It's a fun game. I encourage people, we'll have a link to this in the show notes. It's as fun because at the end you end up with a physical artifact, this text that you developed, like when you do Microscope and you have a timeline and you have that at the end. This provides that same thing. So I really dug it and very happy that I played it.
Cool.
Listeners, we're going to go on to our second segment.
Hey listeners, Jason here. I want to let you know that Brindlewood Bay is now available in the Gauntlet's $6 Patreon feed. Brindlewood Bay is a Powered by the Apocalypse game about a group of elderly women solving murder mysteries in and around the namesake town. As they investigate these crimes, they become increasingly aware of the activities of a dark cult called the Midwives of the Fragrant Void, and will have to come up with a plan to stop them. The game is basically Murder, She Wrote meets The Shadow over Innsmouth, and we think you're going to love it. Your $6 pledge in February gets you everything you need to play Brindlewood Bay. The core rules, including a file for printing them as a zine, character sheets and other play aids, plus 5 mysteries: Dad Overboard, All Hallows Scream, The Great Brindlewood Bay Bake Off, Jingle Bell Shock, and A Murder Most Mucky. So head over to patreon.com/gauntlet and make a $6 pledge to get Brindlewood Bay. Keep your pledge active and you'll also get new issues of our magazine Codex every month. Thanks.
So for our second segment, our guest, Austin Ramsey, is going to talk about a game that they ran on the Gauntlet for us and why they're talking about it at this particular time, because it's my understanding that you are setting up for Kickstarter.
On March 2nd, the Kickstarter for Beam Saber will be launching, and you'll be able to find the pre-launch page right now if you're listening to it before then, or it should redirect to the campaign itself if you're hearing this afterwards. You can just go to tinyurl.com/beamsaberkickstarter, all one word, and that'll get you there. And Beam Saber is a Forged in the Dark game about pilots of powerful machines in a war that dominates every facet of life. They're trying to do their part and then get out physically and mentally intact. And hopefully they can help others get out too. Because there's no ending the war, there's just surviving it. And so I ran that for 5 players earlier this month.
5's a big number for Forged in the Dark.
Yeah, it was supposed to be 4, but there was a little bit of confusion regarding the RSVP process. Well, someone on the main RSVP, I thought that they weren't going to make it.
Okay.
And so someone on the wait list got into the game, and then the person who was on the actual RSVP got back to me, and so I was like, all right, that's fine. I don't want the waitlist person has already put in the effort. I don't want to boot them. Ran a game with 5 people, which was one of the issues with the session. The game is designed for 3 to 5 players, including the GM.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, 5 PCs was definitely a bit too much. I have run it with that many people before at conventions. And again, run into the similar issue of trying to make sure that everyone gets sufficient spotlighting.
And Forged in the Dark is a weird engine. We ran a Blades in the Dark game with 6 players for a very long time, and you begin to realize how much having those extra players allows people to absorb the damage and the stress and so on, that each body actually insulates them from consequences in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Even just resisting consequences aside, having the extra resources to throw at accomplishing your goals, pushing yourself for those extra dice, more people can do it. It absolutely does change things.
So I've gotten you off topic. Tell us about what Beam Saber is, what your inspirations are, and how this came about.
I have been a fan of the mech genre for a long time. Going back probably as far as Power Rangers is probably my first exposure, but there's been a lot more since then. And so Beam Saber is primarily inspired by Generation Kill, which is a HBO show based on a nonfiction book about the initial stages of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, if I'm recalling the date correctly. Mm-hmm. And it's also inspired by Friends at the Table, which is an actual play podcast.
Oh.
And lastly, of course, well, there's a big old list of touchstones in the rule book. These are just sort of like the primary three, I would feel. And the third one is, of course, Mobile Suit Gundam, specifically the 08th MS team. And the reason for that is the 08th is a mini-series that focuses on a small group of characters instead of like one major pilot. And it's extremely down-to-earth in terms of their relationships and also the machines that they're in. They're just like the grunt troops, none of them are the heroes the typical anime heroes. So yeah, I really wanted to capture that real robot genre feel of not having a god machine, but still having a tank for everyone, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us about the mechanics and what this looks like in a Forged in the Dark concept. How much are you kind of adhering to Forged? How are the mecha handled? I'm really curious about this.
Yeah, so there's a lot that will be familiar for people who are familiar with Blades or Scum and Villainy and so forth. There's still stress, there's still consequences and clocks and resist rolls and Schrodinger's inventory. So for the pilots themselves, they aren't too different. Playing as the pilot will be fairly familiar. And there is pilot play alongside the vehicle play, because it's important to have that contrast between what a person can do versus what a vehicle can do, what their massive robotic body represents to them. As for the play, once you're in your vehicle, it's, again, follows the same sort of like core gameplay of roll a few dice, take the highest, 1 to 3, failure and consequence, 4 and 5, success with consequence, 6 is success, no consequence, that sort of thing. And the vehicle has its own damage track. The big difference between them is the quirk system and the way that load is handled for the vehicle. So for the load, again, you don't need to pick it right away. Mm-hmm. But if you decide that you have a heavy vehicle, then you're almost always going to have a heavy vehicle. And on top of that, once your gear is declared, it's hard to undeclare that gear. You have to spend resources during downtime to remove it. And so that gear can also be destroyed as a consequence, and then you're just left with junk strapped to your vehicle. Or you can even sacrifice it to use it as armor, if you're so inclined, which junks it, but at least you didn't take, whatever consequence there was. And for the quirks, they function similar to stress, not quite the same. You spend 1 quirk to push yourself, and your vehicle starts with 4. You can get up to 8 through actions and downtime by upgrading your vehicle. But quirks, notably, are narrative in nature. They have a pair of descriptors that can either benefit you or hinder you. If they hinder you during a mission, then that'll get you XP at the end of the session. And when you use them to push yourself or resist a consequence, you have to explain how you take advantage of that quirk in the narrative. So if you have aggressive targeters as a quirk, you could describe about how that is used to get you a cleaner shot when attacking something, but you couldn't use it to describe how your vehicle goes faster to avoid something. What else is there? Another thing that is pretty important is how Fiction First plays in with the vehicles. Because when you design your vehicle, you're not just picking your quirks and your load, you're also describing the general structure of your vehicle. I say vehicle very purposefully as opposed to mech, because you don't have to play something with legs. You could play a fighter jet if you were so inclined. One of the earliest playtest groups had a pilot whose vehicle was a future Dodge Charger. So just, a muscle car. That allows players a lot of flexibility about what they want their vehicle to be. You can get some really weird ones if you play often enough, or if you just decide to randomly generate them using the tables in the appendices. Because of that self-description of what the vehicles are, that means that that'll interact with the fiction, of course, and set up the position and effect and what options are available for action. If you decide that your vehicle just hovers, then getting over like a still body of water isn't an obstacle. You probably don't even need to roll, but maybe there's some other downside, such as it's hard for you to stop. So you get to the other side, you slam on the brakes because there's a minefield, but then you actually have to roll just to stop because you don't want to keep sliding and end up getting blown up.
So for the vehicles, are there distinct playbooks for the different modes, or is this like a playbook and you're kind of putting it together out of the mech building system that you've got?
Each playbook, so you pick your pilot playbook, and that'll of course provide specialist equipment for your pilot, but it also provides specialist equipment for your vehicle.
Oh.
And that vehicle specialist equipment will be similar in nature to the pilot version. For instance, the Scout gets a fine sniper rifle, and their vehicle gets a fine heavy cannon as the vehicle reflects the pilot within. Of course, you don't have to take that specialist gear if you don't want to. Everyone also has access to a set of standard gear, but the really exciting stuff tends to be in the specialist gear. So between your quirks, your fictional description of your vehicle, and then the specialist gear available to you, that sort of determines what kind of vehicle you end up with.
Let me ask about how the session itself went. You had 5 players, things that went well in it, things that didn't go as well, because you said you had some worries about that.
So the session we ran was one that I've run a number of times before, because I have on the Beam Saber blog a bunch of pre-made missions that I've put up there. The way that mission prep works in Beam Saber, the rules have a very clear guidelines on how to do that, and if you follow them by the end, you've essentially got an adventure module made. So there's one that I've used a number of times for conventions and one-shots, so I'm pretty familiar with it at this point. So I ran that for the Gauntlet Hangout. One of the elements in it is that there are hostile digital entities that appear if the group takes too long in a place or draws too much attention to themselves, sort of like digital ghosts. And they have some limited ability to manipulate the physical realm, whether it's by hacking and infesting the vehicles of the players or by tapping into the machinery of the world around them. A description I often go to is that if there's one of these corrupted apps that was in charge of selling people, laser eye surgery, and it's become corrupted, it'll try and forcibly make you a client.
So it's a malware? I mean, it's like things that have, when they become corrupted, they become a kind of malware?
Yes, absolutely. That's a very good way of thinking of it. So this particular mission had a strong instance of that. There was also more traditional enemies in vehicles. One of the players was playing the hacker playbook, which unsurprisingly has a lot to do with these digital entities. So it was really good to get to see that playbook go head-to-head with these apps and proxies. And the player also said that he was happy that the hacker playbook had something to do that he'd played. He tends towards playing hackers, and a lot of times they just sort of like get forgotten about in a sense because there's not something to do for them. So that worked out really well. At the same time, those digital entities was part of the problem that I had with the session, was that eventually the physical threats had been dealt with. The enemy vehicles and pilots were all gone, but the corrupted apps were still lingering. And so the party had to try and deal with those before they could extract their objective. But it sort of dragged a bit at the end, and I think I probably should have just let them go at that point and not had them dealing with the proxies and apps. And part of the problem with that was that obviously the hacker was the most relevant playbook for dealing with them, but he kept not getting such good rolls. And so that delayed the extraction of the objective and the end of the mission.
It sounds like you had some of those standard things with a few too many players, and then the wrap up. Did you miss some parts in your game that you wanted to get to?
Yeah, there's a really important part of the game is how stress is relieved during downtime. There's we just did not get to downtime at all, unsurprisingly, as will likely happen in most one-shots of Forged in the Dark games. There's a Beam Saber Discord, and the community there sort of feels that the game doesn't really come alive until you've had your first cut loose scene. Because during downtime, the way that you remove stress is not by indulging in a vice, it's by cutting loose with one of your fellow pilots.
Oh, that's really good.
Yeah, it's what I call the cut loose connection assist loop. Because during downtime, you cut loose with another pilot, you have a scene together, you describe how you relieve stress alongside them. And that might be, you get drinks together, or you hang out together while you're both fixing your vehicle, or maybe you just tear a strip off of them for what happened during the mission. So you have with every other pilot in your squad a connection clock. That's a 4-tick clock. And after you cut loose, you roll a number of dice equal to how many ticks you have with them. And that determines how much stress you heal. And then once you heal that stress, you add another tick. And with each tick, you have a belief about that pilot, which is something that isn't necessarily true, but it's something that you think about them that you might tell to a confidant. And if that causes you to struggle during the mission, you get XP at the end of the session.
Cool.
And once you fill up that clock, you come to a new understanding with that pilot. So you get to ask a question about one of those beliefs, and the player has to answer truthfully. And then you reset the clock to 1 and write a new belief about them again, based upon the answer to the question that you just asked.
That is nice. One of the things with plays is it doesn't have a lot of role-play character interplay built into its structure. You could skip a lot of that if you just went through the steps. So that's kind of lovely.
Yeah, and it comes back in the missions as well, beyond just struggling with your beliefs, which is that in Beam Saber, when you assist someone, you always spend stress. You never spend quirks. The amount of stress you spend when you're assisting is determined by how strong your connection is with the person you're assisting. Because the more emotionally invested you are in that pilot, the more stressful it is when you need their help, or when they need your help. But also, the harder you push yourself to aid them. And so you give them additional benefits. Instead of just getting one benefit for one stress, if you have a connection of 3 with them, it costs you 3 stress to help, but they get 3 benefits, 3 unique benefits. You can't do plus 3 dice, but you can do improved effect, position, and an extra die.
Ooh, that's an interesting tactical option, and it's awesome role-playing.
Yeah, and of course, the more you assist them, the more stress builds up, needing you to cut loose again. And there it is, the cut loose connection assist loop.
Awesome. That is really clever. So where am I going to be able to go to get this game then?
Well, if you're listening to this before or during the Kickstarter, you can back it there. It'll be available in PDF and in a hardcover book.
Oh, nice.
Is how it's going to be released as. And the URL for that is tinyurl.com/BeamSaberKickstarter, all one word. If you missed the Kickstarter and you're listening to this a ways later, then you can go to austin-ramsey.itch.io, and that's where I sell my games, and you'll be able to find Beam Saber there. Currently, it's technically available on itch, but because I want people to hold off on buying the game on itch so that they'll back the Kickstarter, it's currently set at $3,000 for a copy. It will go down. I think it'll probably be $25 after the Kickstarter. I'm not 100% sure on the price, but if you want to buy it for $3,000, I'm not going to stop anyone.
I'm held off, but I'm looking forward to giving this a try. It sounds really cool. Some real innovation there.
There actually is available for free right now for anyone who wants to try the game. There's a quick start guide that's available, which you can find at tinyurl.com/beamsaber. There's also a link to it on the itch page, if I recall correctly. That's not the full rules. It leaves out a lot of the setting information and a lot of the stuff for long-term play, a lot of the GM directions, but it will let you create characters, run a mission, and do downtime.
Okay.
Awesome.
Anything special we should be expecting for the Kickstarter? Have you planned out stretch goals? Are you going more minimal? What's your thought on that?
Well, for stretch goals, this is my first Kickstarter, so I'm not doing anything. Doing a hardcover book is already a big enough thing to go right off the bat. So the current stretch goals that I have planned are just increased payment to the people who've worked on the game.
100%. That's really good.
Yeah, I want to make sure that everyone who works on it is getting a good payout. So the first stretch goal is actually that I get paid. And then after that, it'll just be increasing the payment that people get. For tiers that people might want to look out for reward tiers, there is a pair of tiers. One is that you send me a description of a character, and they will end up in the art in the book. No promises about whether they'll be a pilot or whether they'll be like a background character, because I can't guarantee that, especially since I want to include a diverse range of people in the pilot playbook art. And the other option is you send in a vehicle description, and that'll be included in the playbook as one of the example vehicles, because there's already 12 of them in the rules, but there will be slots for another 6, if I'm recalling correctly, or it might be another 12. I guess maybe if I hit all my stretch goals, I'll open up another stretch goal that is like more slots for that reward tier.
And I just want to say, having looked at the beta rules, this is a solid, serious, lengthy, well-developed set of rules. I've read most of the Forged in the Dark hacks that are out there and the main rule books, and this is an impressive book when you look at it. I think this is going to be dynamite, and I'm really looking forward to the Kickstarter.
Well, thank you for saying so.
Listeners, we're going to go to our final segment. So, for the final segment, we're going to each discuss something that's been inspiring us or giving us joy. Each of us is going to go. So, Sherry, let's start with you. Let's ask you, what's giving you life?
So, lately we've been watching a lot of the Bon Appetit YouTube videos where they cook something or they do a challenge. Essentially, these are the test kitchen and sort of contributing editor people. And they're a group of, I'm going to guess, they're younger employees. They are overall a really kind, giving, nice set of people, and the range of the YouTube videos ends up creating a sort of cozy, non-linear workplace comedy that you slowly, over time, you grow to love all of these characters. Even at first, you were like, that guy's a little weird. But the more you watch him, you really start to like Andy and Brad and Claire and Carla and Chris, and and you go, oh, there's a new Chris one, yay, let's go see it. And of course the other people are in the background doing things and reacting and coming over to taste, and it's like a strangely endearing group of people that you come to like, even though the magazine always comes off as kind of pretentious, they don't. And it's just a real joy. I have really been enjoying it, and if you're looking for some content on YouTube, I can't suggest anything more highly than the Bon Appetit just group of videos. Anything from them is sort of a hoot to watch, and the more you watch, the more you like them.
Yeah, I really like the ones where I think it's Claire tries to make gourmet junk food.
Mm-hmm.
Those are really fun.
I like that everyone, she goes to the depths of despair and then has to pull herself out, and people have to come and talk her back, and it's all really real and sincere. It's just very funny. She's so invested in her attempts. It's good.
For me, I'm going to mention something I may have mentioned on a Giving Me Life before a while back, but I just started rereading The Craft Sequence by Max Gladstone. These are a series of fantasy novels that are sort of fantasy legalist in a world with dead gods and accountancy. There's fantasy accountancy going on with colonialist themes and decolonialization, and the books are so smart. They've got great characters. They've got great POC characters. They've got a really interesting magical trans character as a protagonist in the third book, and they're really good. They're smart, weird, brilliant world building. And there's, I think, 6 of them. I've gotten back, and I'm in the middle of the third one again, and they're really good. I can't recommend them highly enough.
What is one of the titles, so you have something to search on?
Oh, my gosh.
Ask the hard question.
Max Gladstone Craft Sequence. Because I know on Amazon you can get all of the Kindle editions together of all the books as one sort of mass package for actually a pretty reasonable price.
Awesome.
Austin, what about for you? What's giving you life?
I've been lately really enjoying the podcast called Well, There's Your Problem, which is a podcast about engineering disasters.
Oh, wow.
The topic itself is very grim, and oftentimes it definitely is a bit of a downer. But I enjoy gallows humor and dark humor a lot, and they bring that sort of energy to it. And they have a really good rapport, the 3 of them. And they try and find, what went wrong here and what are some things that hopefully can go better in the future. So that they cover a lot of interesting topics and go in depth about why these things happened. So it's sort of like a 1 part engineering lesson, 1 part black comedy.
Do you have a particular favorite episode or particular interesting thing they talked about?
It's one of the more harrowing episodes, but I really enjoyed the episode on the Grenfell Tower fire.
Oh, yeah.
That happened fairly recently. I think it was 2015 that it happened.
Mm-hmm.
Terrible.
Yeah, but learning about all the various things that built up to causing it, from gross negligence and changes in policy that allowed that negligence to occur, and just bad decisions and weird differences between fire code in North America versus in Britain. They just don't do sprinklers over there, apparently, which is mind-boggling to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that sounds very cool, and I love that kind of getting your hands in the nubs of things there. Listeners, that's our show. If you want to help us out, you can rate or leave a comment about us. That really does help on your podcatcher of choice. The Gauntlet Podcast is one of our network of podcasts. We also have Plus One Forward, which is our podcast about PBTA games. And we have Fear of a Black Dragon, which is our OSR podcast. And we have a backlog of a bunch of other pocket-sized play and discern realities. And we've got a lot of great stuff out there that I encourage you to check out. You can find out more about the Gauntlet at gauntlet-rpg.com. And of course, if you need to get a hold of us, you can message us on Twitter at GauntletRPG. Austin, thank you for coming on and joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And Sherry, thank you for once again co-hosting, even though I know you hate the sound of your own voice.
I hate it so much.
Listeners, that is our show.